Chapter 25 is a transitional chapter. In this chapter, Abraham passes away, and the focus of the book of Genesis transitions to Isaac and then to Jacob. And the reason is because the covenant God made with Abraham was passed to his son Isaac and then to Isaac's sons Jacob. And so Genesis is following the line here from Abraham to Isaac and then to Jacob. God, in the Scriptures, He identifies Himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob because of the covenant that He made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so there's a transition. Abraham passes away, which is kind of hard to believe, isn't it? I mean, we started with Abraham back in chapter 12, however many months ago that was, and we've watched him and his life of faith, and we've seen him where he has demonstrated great faith in God, and we've seen where he stumbled in his faith and times where he blew it, and we've kind of gone on this journey with Abraham, and now we come to this point where he passes away. You know, in Ecclesiastes it says, to everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die. And here it's a time when Abraham dies. And there's this transition that takes place. And transitions like this in life can be very, very difficult, very unsettling for us. But it's helpful when we can see the faithfulness of God even in that difficulty, even in that transition, even in the passing of someone, to still see God being faithful through that. And that's what we see here with Abraham. But before we say goodbye to Abraham, we're told in chapter 25 that Abraham remarries. Abraham's first wife, Sarah, passed away in chapter 23, and now he takes a second wife named Keturah. Abraham was 137 years old when Sarah died. And we know, because we're told in the passage, that he lives another 38 years after Sarah dies. And in that 38 years, he remarries. So, you know, he remarries when he's like 140 years old. Good on you, Abraham, right? I mean, don't you love those stories when you hear about like a couple that meets in their 90s and gets married, two widows, you know, a widower and a widow, and I read an article about a couple, they got married when the wife was 98 and the husband was 94 years old, and they got married. And they met at a gym. Isn't that, I mean, that's just as amazing to me, the 98, 94, and they're still going to the gym. So here's Abraham. He's, you know, again, he's somewhere north of 137, and he marries again. He marries a woman named Keturah, and her name means perfume. Isn't that nice? I'm assuming she smelled sweet, you know, but. And not only does Abraham remarry, we're told here that he has 6 more sons with his second wife. Amazing. He's having kids. 137 years old, 140 years old, and he has 6 more sons. Now, if you remember, Abraham was 100 years old when Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and we looked at this passage back then, but in Romans chapter 4, we're told that Abraham's body was already dead back when he was 100 years old, meaning that he was not physically able to make a baby with Sarah, and God restored Abraham's ability to make a baby, and he and Sarah had Isaac, and that apparently wasn't just a temporary fix, because now he's got 6 more sons. with his second wife, Keturah. In verse 2, we're given the names of the sons of Abraham that he had with Keturah. And these sons that are mentioned here, and some of them, their children are mentioned here, Abraham's grandchildren, these sons would themselves become distinct peoples and nations, and they settled primarily in the Arabian Peninsula. So some of the people that are living today in the Arabian Peninsula, places like Saudi Arabia, some of them are descendants of Abraham and Keturah today. Now, a couple names to note in this list here in verse 2. First of all is Midian. Midian. Now, in the book of Exodus, Moses flees from Egypt and he goes to Midian. And he lives in Midian for 40 years. And it's there that he takes a wife and he works for his father-in-law, Jethro, as a shepherd. And Jethro is a Midianite. Moses' wife is a Midianite. And so, Moses and Jethro are distant cousins through Abraham. And as I said, Moses lived in Midian for 40 years before returning to Egypt to lead the Hebrew people out of their captivity in the Exodus. Also mentioned in verse 2 is Shuah. Shuah was the home of the shortest man in the Bible. Bildad the Shuhite is from the family of Shuah. Some of that joke went way over your head. It's going to click at lunch. You'll be sitting eating a sandwich, and you're going to say, wait, Bildad the Shuhite, the shortest man in the Bible. I get it. But Bildad the Shuhite is mentioned in Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now, the reason this list is given for us here, as we're coming to the end of Abraham's life, and looking at his life here, and the reason this list of Abraham's sons by Keturah and his grandsons is given for us is it's telling us this because it's a fulfillment of one of the promises God made to Abraham back in chapter 17, verse 4. If you're taking notes back there, chapter 17, verse 4, God promised to make Abraham the father of many nations. Not just the Hebrew people, but the father of many nations. And so here we are at the end of Abraham's life. Abraham passes away, and we're reminded that God kept his word to Abraham. That God was faithful to his promises with Abraham. Again, if we were at a memorial service for Abraham, this is something that would bring great comfort to us during a difficult time, to know that God was faithful to him. God kept his promises. God kept his word.